So Siqi, why don't we start out, the kind of overall topic of today is going to be storytelling. So I'd like to hear kind of Runway's story, whatever that means to you.
Okay. Wow, we're going to get right into it. I'm going to go into a bit of a backstory around how we got to this story. But the mission of Runway is to make business accessible and understandable to everyone. And the company got started because I was appointed CEO of this company called Sandbox VR. I joined as the Chief Product Officer about in 2018, and I joined because we were fundraising for Postmates. So we were on this Asia tour with the CEO, and I tried it in Hong Kong for the first time. The company is founded in Hong Kong, and it was the most mind-blowing experience I've had since I've seen the iPhone for the first time. So I immediately told the CEO, I'm going to move to Hong Kong now, work here. Long story short, we raised a bunch of money, and then COVID hit. And shortly before COVID hit, I was lucky enough to be appointed CEO of this company right before COVID hit. And we're raising money. And for you, how many have done or been to a Sandbox VR at some point? Raise your hand. Okay, a few people, cool. So what we do is we have these retail locations in malls around the world, and you're basically on this real-time motion capture stage, and you put on a VR headset, you're with friends, and you have a full virtual body. So like hands, legs, you can high-five your friends, and you go on these VR adventures together. So you can go on Star Trek. But anyway, the company's doing great. We had 400 employees. It was like scaling really nicely, and then COVID hit, and all of our revenue went down to zero. And when COVID hit, what all the funds did is they had to triage all of their companies because no other fund was going to fund a new company when that happened. And we were on the bottom of that list for sure at Andreessen, right? Along with probably Limebike. And so in order to get emergency funding, because the Series B that we were counting on is no longer going to happen, we had to create all kinds of scenarios for how we're going to operate a business if COVID was going to last 3 months, 6 months, or 2 years. And at the time, people kind of forget that in March of 2020, Elon Musk tweeted that COVID is going to be over by June of 2020. And when we talked to Andreessen, they're like, no, it's going to be 2 years. And at that time, everyone thought that was the most crazy thing, and it turned out to be basically spot on. So we were creating all of these scenarios on spreadsheets with our CFO, who came from Netflix, and it was just a miserable, error-prone experience. I didn't like it. We did it on Google Sheets. And we had to basically hibernate the company. So we went from 400 employees to 10. I laid myself off, an entire executive team. About 30 minutes later, I asked our CFO, there was something better we could have used here, right? Like Figma's a thing now, Notion's a thing now. Surely there's better products that exist for this problem. And he laughed and said, no, this is kind of it. So I talked to the Andreessen team and I said, what if someone made a really, really good version of Figma quality, Notion quality execution for a finance product? And they said, yeah, we've been looking for someone to do this. So that's how the company got started. The mission of the company has never changed. As we got into the details of finance, one of the key things that we realized is that finance is actually not about finance at all. Finance is actually about everything that happens in a company. Every person, everything that you do, every line of code you write, every feature at some point falls down to the bottom line. And so the problem is actually much more rich than finance. And so we've been working on that for quite a while. And the core narrative of Runway is something a little bit different. We peeled back some layers, but happy to talk to you how we got there. But that is a high-level story of how Runway got started.
Let's hear how we got there.
Okay. I was like, I was.
They're not here for me to talk.
I just came from a panel, and I'm like to take turns. Now I'm not used to like I'm the only one talking, but I guess here we are. So I'll tell you what our story was before we met this magical person who taught me basically everything I know about fundraising, about storytelling. So the story that we raised 2 rounds with is the following, which is that the business and finance is really, really confusing, and it shouldn't be, right? So the default state of the world, what people generally believe out there is that finance is so complicated that you have to have experts with MBAs and these are the people that you trust to understand them, and you don't have to worry about that. And because we have these experts who understand finance, people like engineers and designers and whoever, we can just focus on the work that we love doing, because the real business people are going to run the companies. And what we believe is that actually everyone should understand business. This is really, really important because we spend most of our waking lives working somewhere. And if we just work somewhere and we don't understand why the work that we're doing matters, how the business works, then it's hard to find purpose in it. And so it's actually really important for us to understand why we're doing what we're doing. And that's why business should be understandable to people, and it's not. And the reason why it's not is because, one, it's really complicated, but two, the tools just aren't good enough. If you ever gotten a spreadsheet from a finance person, you look at it and it's indecipherable. It's like index, match, VLOOKUP, whatever. And it's a wall of numbers. And so our belief is that you can build better tools to make it understandable to people, and that's why we exist. So that's the story that we started with. And I think it's a good enough pitch to raise a good amount of money with, at least, right? But what happened is we met our only advisor at Runway, and we met this person through Gary, and his name is Wolfgang Hammer, and he's a Hollywood person who wanted to create a new TV series, Silicon Valley, but actually not funny, but serious, like *Halt and Catch Fire*, but modern day, right? That's like the idea for this new show. And he asked Gary to meet some like founders that would be interesting to talk to. So I talked to him, and he became really just interested in what we're doing at Runway, and he decided to advise us for free. And it was so valuable that I'm like, no, you have to take some like shares in this company. So he was an executive producer of House of Cards and Game of Thrones, and ran Lionsgate and Miramax. So he is like just such a philosopher about storytelling. And he taught me this framework about stories and how he thinks about this. So he described this 3 layers of story. And the first 2 layers people are generally familiar with. The first layer is action, right? It's what happens in a story, the plot. The second layer is emotion. It's the emotions that the characters feel and the emotions that we, the audience, feels through these characters. And people generally understand that those are components of a good story. What was new is this third layer, and he talked about like the really memorable, impactful stories that have this like certain depth to them, have this deeper layer. And he described this layer as this conflict between worldviews. And interesting stories play out this conflict between worldviews through the eyes of a single character. And for different types of stories, there's only so many like archetypes of conflicts and worldviews. Usually for a startup story, the conflict is between a worldview that's called the global dominant worldview and the global underdog worldview. And so the global dominant worldview is the default state of the world. It's what people walk around without thinking generally believe. And it is very, very reasonable, very, very seductive and attractive. And it should feel like that. And the key thing here is that in every story, actually, of this archetype, that worldview is always a worldview held by the antagonist of the story, the bad guy. And in opposition to that worldview is a global underdog worldview. And the global underdog worldview sees the subtle lies in that global dominant worldview and can imagine some better world. And the conflict between these worldviews gets played out through the eyes of a single character, and that is how a story unfolds. One of the things that he says that I love hearing, that I love to quote, is like, all stories are really about a single person, right? So in Star Wars, the worldview conflict is on some level about freedom and control, and it's played out through the eyes of a single character, which is Luke Skywalker, right? That's basically the story. So that's the framework. And the key learning I had from that is that it is so hard and so important to get the global dominant worldview right. And the reason why this is so hard is because you need to be as generous and realistic as possible to that dominant worldview. Otherwise, you do not have a believable story. Because the dominant worldview is the bad guy's worldview. And what makes stories believable are actually believable villains, right? You think about Breaking Bad or Walter White or Thanos in Avengers even. They all have a very sympathetic, motivations. And there's a reason for that, because if the villain is a bad guy twirling their mustache, it's entirely unbelievable, right? And when you don't have a believable villain, you don't have a believable hero, and you don't have a believable story. And so I work with some founders, and they ask me, like, how can I improve their pitch? And the first question I ask them is, tell me the most generous, realistic, good story about your most formidable competitor, as if you were the founder, as if you were their head of marketing. And the remarkable thing about this is, like, I've talked to many founders, and they're very, very smart. They understood assignment. And without fail, the answer is the opposite of the question I asked. They will say, oh yeah, we have this competitor, but they're like, here's the ways in which they're lying, and like they say this, but it's terrible. And I would let them talk for a minute, and then I would stop them and say, I just want you to notice that your answer was the opposite of the question I asked. And they're like, oh my God. And this is so hard. It's so hard for us as founders, because we spend all of our time thinking about the ways in which the world's broken and the ways in which we're going to make it better through the work that we do. But if you want to have a memorable story, you cannot do that, because when you do that, you end up with a straw man of a villain. And when you have a straw man of a villain, you end up with a story that is not believable, and usually the same story that everyone else is telling. So let me give you an example with Runway, right? The thing that we realized with Runway is that in the first story that I told, what is effectively the global dominant worldview? It is finance is complicated, but it's okay because we have experts who run the show, and we have great products that serve the experts so that no one else has to understand finance, and they can basically be cogs in the machine of the business, right? And when you really think about it, though, even if you think about Oracle or Salesforce or Megacorp, who is actually saying it's okay for people to just be cogs in a machine at work? Like, nobody. That's entirely a straw man that we made up because we wanted our story to somehow sound more appealing, right? And then when we look at our competitors' websites, what do they say? They're not saying, oh, yeah, it's okay for you to just like focus on finance and no one else understand it. They're actually advertising strategic finance, connected planning. You should connect all the different departments together. So invisibly, I just told a story, and I thought it would make sense to me. It was a story that I liked. And it's the same story as everyone else in the space. And that's because we just weren't honest about the default state of the world. And so it's very difficult to have a story where our story, yes, we say the same shit as everyone else, but we do it for realsies, is not a good message. So we had to dig deeper and figure out, like, okay, the people are coming to Runway, and they're buying the product, so something is working. There's a reason why they're doing it. Why is that? And so we had to go a level deeper, and it was a very long and difficult process to figure out, okay, what is the most generous telling of the global dominant worldview? And we worked on this for weeks because it's hard to get your mind even to like be fair to your competitors. But I'll skip forward, and we can talk about how some of the details how we got there. But our current conflicting worldviews is the default dominant worldview is that the office of the CFO is under more pressure than ever to be strategic. And there are amazing products today that help with this. The problem with the office of CFO today is that they have so little time. They're spending so much time working on these manual things. And we have great products that save them time, that automate reporting, that give them more control, that makes reporting better. And all of these things now free up their time so they can actually do what they're supposed to do, what they're under pressure to do, which is to be strategic and be collaborative. And when I recount that story, I could go to our competitors' websites and like, that is the story that they're telling. And I think it's a pretty good one. Like, I would reasonably buy that. And that's what you want. It is so good that you want to buy that product, right? Our underdog worldview says, yes, the office of the CFO is under more pressure than ever to be collaborative and be strategic. The lie in that story is that saving time is not enough to actually do it. Because in order to actually be strategic, you have to collaborate with the other departments. And for collaboration to happen, people have to understand context. They have to understand how the business works. And you can share all of the spreadsheets that you want and the databases and give people access to this stuff, but none of it matters if the people on the other end don't even understand what they're looking at, which is the state of the world when they get these spreadsheets. So actually, the core of what we do is about understanding, not saving time, and that's the lie that we're telling. So if you look at our mission and you look at how we describe the product and our marketing, all of our marketing is around this central idea that what actually matters is understanding, creating clarity to the different departments, not just finance. And when you have that core of the story, all of a sudden everything changes. It's not just a marketing slogan. One of our values is create clarity at Runway because it's central to what we do. When we prioritize product features, we can very now clearly identify what is differentiating, what is table stakes. Table stakes is saving time. We still have to do that. What is differentiating are all the things that we do in engineering, design, and with AI to make it understandable to people outside of finance. So being as honest as possible about the state of the world is a thing that helps you find a one story that only you can say.
You know, Siqi, one thing that I find really fascinating about Runway is that you use the word clarity and understanding, but what I heard really was you're helping people tell stories about the numbers. Yeah. So you're telling us how to tell stories, or how you figured out how to tell stories about your product, which helps people tell stories, which is a pretty nice loop. I'm curious, kind of, as a result of that, are there any product choices that you make within Runway to maybe subconsciously nudge people towards telling a story with the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, we had this demo video, and it's kind of cool. Like we've seen, for example, we think about it more than just telling stories. I think foundationally, you need to have the right abstractions to hold stories. And what I mean by that is like, when you as an operator, when you think about operating your business, you probably don't think about it in the form of a wall of numbers on a spreadsheet. Like, what do you think about? What is in your head? What is in your head is something like a product roadmap or a marketing plan. And what these represent are things, physical actions that you will do to inflect the trajectory of your business in the future, right? And that context does not live in a spreadsheet. It lives in Google Docs or Notion or wherever. And so one of the key ways that we try to increase that clarity is build these containers that allow you to connect your intent with your numbers. So we have an abstraction called plans. And so when you look at your business in Runway, it's not just numbers. You can see here is a product roadmap. Here is like the different features that we're working on. Here's a marketing roadmap. Here's the different marketing campaigns. And you can move them up and down in terms of how much you want to spend. You can move it left and right to see what happens if you're delayed or earlier. And this is not possible without the right abstractions. And so I think one of the things that we really try to do is think about how people in their heads represent concepts and plans and make it as visual as possible so they can offload those ideas into a visual form. So that's one of the ways we do it. The other way is, if you look at Runway, are there any Runway customers here?
Oh, there's one over there.
What company? Oh, amazing. Thank you. So one of the things that you can do is you create pages, right? And so we have companies that they write their product roadmaps on this page, and you can reference anything in your model as text. So you can say like, if we work on this, you can reference margin or growth or revenue, and it'll tell you what the number is. And when you change your plans, the numbers in text will update in real time, right? So a lot of this is about connecting stories directly with the numbers and directly with the plans that impact those numbers. So that's the second one. A third one is our use of AI in particular is intended to help people understand how the model works. So for example, like every driver and row in Runway has a plain English AI-driven explanation. So if you open it up and you look at burn or ARR, it'll tell you, and this is going to be different for every company because every model is different, how it is calculated. And it doesn't even look like AI, it'll just look like plain text. But we think that's a particularly effective use of AI because you can get value out of it without having to do anything or prompt it or chat with a bot.
Siqi, One thing that I remember a funny story hearing from you is that you at some point considered calling it Runway AI or something of this sort. Uh, could you tell us why you decided not to put AI in the name anywhere?
Yeah, so this is this is April 2020, and if you remember, that's when Clubhouse was first founded. And at this point, Clubhouse only had one room. You open an app, it's just like one room. And in this room, Naval Ravikant would just be on it 24 hours a day, pretty much. And I liked it because it was basically, to me, the Naval Ravikant app. It's the app where I can open it up and just talk to Naval Ravikant anytime I want. It was awesome. And Naval was our first check. So when we were talking about me leaving Sandbox and I have this idea for a finance company, I asked him what he thought. He's like, "It's great. I'll write you a check." I'm like, "Awesome. What should I call it?" Because I've been thinking we should call it CFO.ai, which we still own a domain of, which is now a lot more valuable than it was when we bought it in 2020. And he said, "No, don't call it that. That's a terrible name." I was like, "Why?" He said, "Everything's going to be AI 5 years anyway. Anything with AI is going to be dated in the name. Don't do it. What you should do is just call it Runway and get a .com." So that's what we did.
Cool. I think, time check, it's about time for us to transition to Q&A. Is there anything you kind of want to say before we do that?
No, questions are good.
All right, let's do it. So if anyone has a question in the audience, just raise your hand. I'll point you out, and then fast on. I like it.
I'll just speak. So I think that was great stories about how you did the storytelling for startups. I'm curious if you have run into any like very difficult situations to think about how do I position the story for this startup.
To different audiences, like if there's like a particular difficult objection.
Like you are an advisor to different startups.
Sorry.
So I bet for some of the startups it's easier to do because of the product and the target audience, but for some of them it might be hard to do. Yeah, can you share about that?
Yes, I can. What I found when I'm helping startups with their story is a thing that makes it more difficult is when there is not a good reason the founder is working on the thing. So the best stories that are easier is like, the first question I like to ask the pitch doctor story is like, why are you doing what you're doing? And that's like first act of a 3-act play I have this like format for fundraising or a pitch. The first act is an origin story. And the answer to that is when it's surprising and interesting and also completely not present in the pitch, that's when there's gold, right? Like it's when the pitch is like imagine the pitch starts with the total addressable market for like home remodeling in the United States is actually $100 billion. And like, we're gonna apply AI to this and we're gonna make it better. What do you feel? Okay, but then I asked like, why are you working on this? And the answer was, my dad was a contractor, and I grew up seeing him remodel all of these homes, and the amount of logistics and different tools and lack of materials was crazy. It was just so inefficient. I grew up seeing this, and then I became an engineer, and I realized we could make this better. What do you feel now? So like, if there is a good purpose and reason behind that, and it's not told, that's easy. The converse of that is, well, I saw on Twitter it's cool to be a founder and moved to SF, and I was looking for an idea. That's much, much harder. The best stories are about single people and they're personal.
Thank you. Sorry, brown jacket.
Hey, Siqi. Yeah, so maybe related to that question, how much do you think about like the founder's origin story as part of like the public-facing story of the company? So to give an example, it's like almost impossible to think of Andrew without also thinking of Palmer Luckey. And then maybe in contrast to that, like to this day, I still don't know like who the founder of Notion is.
Yeah.
Right. So
I do.
Obviously, you can with both methods, but like, how do you think about that, and then how does that change as the company matures and scales?
So to repeat the question, if I'm understanding it, the question's how much of a company is tied to the founder's persona, and how does that change over the company's life?
I mean, I think in defense of Notion, like Ivan's early origin story, I find it pretty memorable. It's actually on their website. He wanted to build tools to help people build tools. I think they probably just didn't do a good enough job of focusing on it, and it could be a lot more well-known and powerful story. But it's funny you mentioned Anduril, because your question was like, how much of the personal founder story should be part of the company story? And Anduril's actually my archetypical example and where I learned a lot of this from. And so Lulu Chung was a CMO, I think, at Activision, and was the person who worked with Palmer on Anduril, on their story, and their marketing PR strategy. And it's no accident that it is memorable. And she has this very memorable framework about the role of stories, which I use a lot. So the default way people think about stories is that it is one of the things you do in your company, right? You write code, you design products, you sell them, you recruit and you raise money, and then you write stories to put in pitch decks. And her framework was that is not the right way to think about a story. The right way to think about it is as a series of concentric circles. And it starts with a founder or a CEO, and they have a particular purpose or meaning behind what they're doing, and that came from Palmer. And that story then goes to the leadership team, and that goes to the wider team, and then it goes to your customers, and it goes to the entire world who are your future customers. And the reason why that framework is so much more powerful is that that's how you make sure you have a cohesive story, that everyone's hearing the same story. And it's not just a story that you told for marketing purposes, because famously, when you have incohesion, one of Enron's values was famously integrity, right? Like you have this lack of cohesiveness, and that destroys companies. But when your leadership team and your employees and your values and how you hire and what you're doing, what you're building, how you're building, what you're talking to investors about, what you're talking to the world about, it's all the same story. That's what creates multiplicative power, and that's why Anduril is so memorable. So, my answer to your question is it absolutely should be the same story. Now, just like any good content strategy, you can have the same central idea, but you can repurpose it in different mediums, different formats, different styles, right? So, we have tweet storms, we have blogs, we have videos, we have podcasts, but it's all the same story. It's just expressed in different ways. And when you have that central idea, you know what the theme of the connecting thread of all of those stories should be over time. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and then how about as the company matures? Would the story be so founder-driven at the seed versus when they're about to go public?
I don't know that it needs to change. It could change, but people identify with people, right? People are fascinated with the Zuck Renaissance, right? And for a long time, the Zuck brand was kind of dragging down the brand of Facebook and Meta. People were like, this is a weird robotic android. And now he's cool. And I bet that probably changes how you feel inside about Meta as a brand. There's a sense of swag to it. And that's because people identify with people. So I think one of the things that I did believe in when I started Runway is the increasing power and value of owning your channels. Legacy media is both unfriendly and dying. And what is powerful is for you as a company and as a person to own the channels. That's why people have heard of Anduril. People don't follow Anduril, people follow Palmer Luckey, and they're a freaking defense, right? If you're building a company, you can probably tell that story. You probably should. I think it's important to do so.
You can follow Siqi on Twitter at Blader, Blader. What's Runway's handle?
X.com.
X.com.
We are unfortunately Runway Co. because we're working on getting Runway, but it's a hard thing. They asked for $10 million for their Twitter handle, if you can believe that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this keynote. I really thought the points about understanding the narrative of your competitors is quite an intriguing point, especially something on the PR front. So that brings me to my question. How do you go about, as a founder, working with journalists and reporters, understanding the impact media can have, but also understanding you don't have full control of the narrative?
So the question is, how do you work with media, journalists, understanding the effect that mainstream legacy media has, while also understanding the drawbacks?
I'm still trying to figure that out. We do have a really, really good PR person who's, I've been on a bunch of podcasts and stuff, and he's just like pounding the pavement. The way he works is really interesting. He's not just like pitching, oh, here's our product, here's our runway. I mean, what he tells me is, hey, I've talked to all these journalists, and like, here's what they're writing about, and here's what they care about, and how do we like position what you know and your story and add value to them, right? So I tweet a lot about AI, and AI is a hot topic. So he gets me meetings with like New York Times and a bunch of journalists, and I get quoted not about Runway, but about like what they're talking about. And so I think it's very similar to sales. You don't want to hard sell your product. You want to understand the pains and the incentives of the person that you're talking to and try to add as much value as you can. And it's the first time I saw that in the PR form. So, but I'm not an expert at this. Our PR person is like actually quite good. So I learned a lot from him. Ignacio is his name.
Sorry, I'm going to try to get someone in the back. Red jacket and then gray jacket in front. We'll do you next.
Yeah, so I want to know, is it very different selling a story to your team, like employees versus, obviously investors? Because I feel like, how do you make it where it doesn't feel like, hey, drink the Kool-Aid versus, right? Like you want people to actually really believe in the vision and kind of have to motivate them.
So the question, sorry for the recording, the question is, how do you kind of tailor your story for different parties, so investors, employees?
This might be literally a 30-minute long answer, and I'm going to just take it, actually. Stop
Go
me
for
on
it.
time. Okay, so the question is, this idea of story, how do you apply it to investors when you're raising a round? And my answer is the same way, with some modifications. So when we were raising for Sandbox, we ended up raising $68 million in 2018 for this VR company. And to give you an idea, this company was founded in Hong Kong. It's like 10 people. And if you are familiar with the venture landscape, there's a few categories that are generally hot, and certainly were hot in 2018. So in 2018, it was a VR winter. And people didn't want to invest in VR. And generally, people don't like to invest in retail companies. Aren't considered a venture category. Generally, people don't like to invest in hardware because that's pretty capital intensive. People also don't like to invest in gaming until recently. AT&T has a games fund, but that certainly wasn't the case in 2018. My job was to raise for a VR company that made hardware that made games that was a retail company. And also, people didn't like investing in Hong Kong or internationally outside of the US. And the way we did it is we put together a story, and we did the best job I could at it. And what I found is really interesting. Because I thought it was going to be basically impossible to raise this round, I was incredibly broad in the investors you talk to. We put together a spreadsheet of like 415 investors, literally anyone who's invested in like any kind of game, consumer, retail, anything. And that was basically all VCs-ish that we could get in touch with. And what I found is that what was really interesting is that the people who cared least about a story were actually the lower tier investors. So like the European ones, no offense, there's some good ones, but like the lower tier investors are lower tier not just because they're not as well known, but because their returns aren't as good. But there were the ones who were like, oh, your one test store in Hong Kong, what is the unit economics of it? And like, what's the 12 months forecast? And when we got to tier one investors, those are the people who asked us like, why are you doing what you're doing? Where is this going? And we said, we think there's going to be a holodeck in every neighborhood. This is going to be the new movies. And if we can do that, this is an enormously valuable company. And my takeaway from that is that the reason why tier one investors are tier one investors is because they understand the assignment. The assignment is to not invest in what has already happened, but invest in the future. And that's, for you as a founder, what you're trying to sell. The lower tier investors think they're investing in public companies, in which case they should probably go do that. Right? A private company just doesn't, a startup in particular, doesn't have that much history to go off of. So they're asking the wrong questions. So that's one observation. So my point in saying that is like whether people care about story or not depends very much on the class and type of investor you're talking to. And the good news is the better investors care about that a lot more. The second framework I have, and this is like my high-level framework about fundraising in general, is that people, I think, mistakenly think that investors are somehow rational people. And my favorite saying is that investors are people too. And people make decisions all in the same way, which is we make decisions based on how we feel. And so the job of a good pitch is to get people to take action, to give you a term sheet. And they give you a term sheet because they feel something. And usually that emotion, by the way, is greed. And I literally will sketch out an emotional arc of the story that I want to tell in my pitch that ends with greed. So like, you know, one of my, and once I started doing this, it put some other things that I've experienced in perspective. So I think 12 years ago, I met Vinod Khosla and I was raising for my second company. And I asked him, how do you make investment decisions? And he looked at me and he said, emotion. And I'm like, thanks for nothing. Like, what does that even mean? And, you know, in retrospect, I realized that he was telling me the answer. That is actually the true answer of why he makes these decisions. Because he's self-aware. He understands like that's like why people do things. So I explicitly think about the goal of a good pitch deck is to deliver emotions. And how do you create these emotions? Stories are humanity's time-tested vehicle for the delivery of emotions. This is why it's important that a pitch deck is in the form of a story. And that's probably unobvious because the default thing to do is to go Google pitch deck template. And every time you're gonna get the 10-slide template of problem, opportunity, competition, market, I forgot what other ones are. And that is, in my own personal opinion, the worst possible template to use. And the reason why that is the case is because if you trace the genetic tree of that template, it always goes back to either Founders Fund or Sequoia. And I have no doubt, actually, that is the preferred pitch deck format. That is what they want. I am not saying they're lying. What I am saying is that their incentives are completely different because their job is to evaluate the companies quickly and only invest in the best ones and do not invest in the ones that aren't going to work. And that template does that. Your job as a founder is to get people to invest in your company no matter what. Those incentives are completely misaligned. I have never raised a round with anything less than 30 slides. And each slide has about 10 words and like a picture or a graph. And I advise founders to have more slides in their deck so that's easy to digest. And I'm not just saying it because like I'm some kind of frou-frou storyteller. I have data for this. So in that sandbox round, we sent out this deck to like 400 people. What we found is that average dwell time per slide is 2.5 seconds. Now, if you think about your own pitch decks, and you knew for a fact that people were going to spend less than 3 seconds per slide, I know that they would have looked very different. But what I also found is that people will go to the end. They will keep on pressing the next button. And so what I wanted to do is for that person just pressing that next button, if they just only read the headlines, they're going to get the entire pitch. And so my process in creating a pitch deck is I will actually write the story in prose form first. And the story has 3 acts, and it follows this emotional arc. The series of emotions that I want to deliver is amusement, curiosity, surprise, awe, and then greed. I'm taking people on this journey. Curiosity because, amusement because I want people to know if they don't invest or learn nothing, at least they won't be bored. And then at least a curiosity because one of the cool things about being an investor is you get to learn about all of these cutting edge secrets in the world that you otherwise wouldn't know. So there's always something interesting there. It's so interesting that someone has devoted their next couple of years, if not decades of their life to. And that curiosity leads to surprise, which is, oh my God, it could be really interesting. And a surprise and leads to awe, which is that, oh my God, if this thing that I just learned happens and then this happens and that happens, this could be one of the most valuable companies ever. And that leads to your final emotion, greed. And this 3-act story I'm trying to write is, again, the first act is origin story. It's basically the story of why you decided to work on this, and explicitly in story form. The second act is the now. How is it going? What is the product? How's the traction? That's like the second third of it. And the last third is the future. Basically, the answer to the question is like, if everything goes right, how does this become one of the largest companies in the world? And the great thing about this is that it is simultaneously the hardest and easiest, but most important part of the deck. And this is another thing that I think most founders get confused a little bit, in that the thing I am so surprised by is that in the majority of pitch decks, this part barely exists. And it makes sense because as founders, we're in the code or executing every day or in the grind. But then we forget that that's not what we're selling. That's not what an investor wants to buy. What an investor wants to buy is a one-way ticket to 100x return town. And you have to tell an incredibly convincing story of step-by-step how that happens. And it almost feels inevitable. And that is a thing that leads to awe and ultimately greed. And once you have all of the 3 components, you want to end with, you want to hear the only good question that I think you want to hear in a pitch, which is, how can I invest? All other questions are bad.
I know there was a second part to the question, but in the interest of time, let's take the next question. And I think I promised the question. Yeah.
Thanks for, by the way, this wonderful opportunity. One question is, for pre-seed founders, one thing is that you actually discover doing a lot of customer discovery. And so does it make sense to actually have a story right in the beginning because you might be pigeonholing your customers?
Great question. And so, inherent in that is this idea that, okay, you have intuition and vision and story, and then you have data and customer discovery and lean startup and iteration, and those two seem at direct conflict. And Eric Ries is actually one of our investors, and we talk about this. And I think, people kind of misunderstand the lean startup. The lean startup became popular because of this misunderstanding, which is that there is some scientific method that you can do a random walk and become a successful company. I don't think any company has been successful doing that. And he's not saying that that is what is going to happen. You need to have an opinion and intuition and idea, and intuition and vision are incredibly powerful forces. And what goes wrong is when you just go straight there, right? When you go straight there and you're not looking, you're going to run into a wall, and you can't just keep on running against a wall. You have to adjust and take on different paths. And that's where data and iteration discovery comes in. And so one of my learnings, certainly with Runway in particular, is it is incredibly important to be stubborn and fixed on that intuition and vision, but be infinitely flexible on how you get there. So our vision has been to make business accessible and understandable to everyone. That has never changed, right? But how do we get there? What is the right wedge? We built for startups. Then we decided that, we learned from talking to customers that our pain wasn't high enough. And how do we make this more accessible? Well, people who do have a willingness to pay are people with finance, who are in finance. And the types of companies that are in finance are larger companies. Startups don't have a finance department. And we're learning from their pains. And what are their pains? They have very specific pains. And we're finding out what those things are. And then we're charging money from it. But we know where we're going. Maybe it'll take 5 years, maybe 10 years, but we're not going to a different place. But we have to be very flexible because we have to earn the right to exist next year and next month. So I don't think they are conflict. And if you can harmonize them, it becomes really powerful.
What are some of your favorite books or podcasts on storytelling?
I don't think I've read any. I couldn't tell you. I literally don't have external resources that I read for this.
Maybe a good question is, what are some of your favorite stories?
I have some of my favorite. Breaking Bad is one of my favorite shows. I really like Star Trek. I'm a Trekkie. What are my favorite stories? I like Billions a lot. Yeah, Billions is great. It's funny. My executive coach is the character that Wendy Rose is based on, and so when we have these meetings, she looks and sounds like her, which is really fun. But Billions is just so great. Like it's if you haven't watched it, I would highly recommend it. But those are some of my favorite stories. Oh, Three Body Problem. I freaking love Three Body Problem. It's one of my favorite works of fiction.
Yeah, so I have this problem. I think you basically talked about like for the status quo, like how to tell that part of the story. But how about the underdog story? You can talk it like in so many different emotions. Like what will be like the emotion that works?
Yeah, I mean the underdog story. I think when I was talking about emotion, it's more for fundraising purposes. I think the underdog story is more about meaning and purpose, and what is intuitive and unique about the company and you as a founder, which I didn't realize before. So it took a long time, and I had a very good guide in helping with this. But in retrospect, one of the breakthrough moments was when we were really struggling, or around trying to figure out what is this story. And just to back up for a minute, what he said repeatedly is what we're trying to do is not to create and invent a story, a new story. That's not going to be a true story. What we're trying to figure out is uncover what is the story that already exists and like remove the layers of cruft over it. And so we know we have the right story when it immediately clicks, and the next day you start using it everywhere without even thinking about it. So there was no memorization required. It's more of a realization. And one of the things that got us closer is he asked me this question, which is, what do you think you're the best in the world at? And my answer was nothing, because that's really hard. And he said, okay, but if you were the best in the world at something, what do you think that would be? And I thought really, really hard about it. And I thought, well, the through line between the things I've been really interested in, from like product design and the things I worked in and in gaming, is what I find really rewarding and I find really I'm like talented at is turning something really, really complicated and just making it more understandable. And then we just let that sit. And a week later, that turned out to be like the central narrative of what Runway was about. And when that happened, I'm like, yeah, that was it. I know that was it. So that's one specific technique of getting there, but I am not an expert coach at this. But that's how we got there, if that's helpful.
Maybe in the back.
I'm not sure if this question will make sense, but like, how do you feel about the concept of antagonists in your story and pitting your company or yourself against another entity or another company or like a larger force beyond, saying like this is like our antagonist in our story?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea of this global dominant worldview, that is the worldview that's held by the villain in most stories. And so inherently, in what I'm saying, in order to have a really good story, you need to have a good antagonist. But the mistake is that people think the antagonist has to be evil or bad in some way. But the greatest stories are when the antagonist is actually innocuous and seductive and attractive and reasonable. And when all of those things are true and your underdog story is still a hero and still believable, that's what makes it so much more interesting and unique and memorable. So yes, and like most people find a villain, but it's a straw man and it's not interesting. Oh yeah, we're starting a new company and we're gonna like do video streaming because YouTube sucks. Does it though? Right? Like if you can't describe all the ways in which YouTube is actually freaking amazing, because it is, then no one's going to believe that story.
Yep.
Thank you for taking all the time to be here. I know we talked a lot about startups and companies and how do we build a story arc around this, but do you have any mental models for building these story arcs for a personal brand or your own personal narrative? If you are to post on Twitter or X or whatever, or Instagram, have you thought about what your personal brand should look like and what should be a good story arc?
I genuinely have not. except for what I didn't want it to be, and I didn't want it to be a thread boy on Twitter. So I post about whatever I think and feel like, and I wanted people to follow me because they wanted to follow me. So maybe the better answer here is, I think someone said this. Maybe it was Gary. I forgot who, but no, Naval said this. People want to have a network, and be in front of investors. And he said the best way to do it is just to do good work. And what you'll find when you do good work is that the network comes to you, right? And I think that's true of personal brands too. Like when you do something interesting and meaningful, that is your personal brand. And you'll find that your network comes to you. So that's how I would think about it. I think like optimizing for that is, I wouldn't say uninteresting, but at least like not likely to be sustainable is my sense. Yeah.
So I think a lot of people do good work, right? People are working in big tech, people are working on their startups. It's hard for that work to be shown to the entire world because people aren't putting the time in to make it a marketable piece of content. One of these, like I heard a quote. I was watching Arnold's documentary on Netflix. I thought it's a corny quote, but it made a lot of sense. It said, "Early to bed, early to rise, work like hell and advertise." Where he just talks about all the different things he does, but he just lets people know about them as well.
Yeah.
Do you think a lot of people are doing good work? What is one way? What are some ways they can make this content, the work they're doing, digestible for a broader audience, so they can understand that this person might actually be doing something interesting?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I will say until Runway, I haven't optimized for that. I have followers on Twitter now only because I made a New Year's resolution to get good at Twitter in 2020 when I started it, because I thought owning the channel was going to be important. I was on Twitter for 13 years, and I tweeted like 20 times before that. But I think it is a good point. I mean, now people ask me like, how do you get good at Twitter? I have Twitter advice, if that helps. One is tweet a lot. Ira Glass had this great framework around how to do good work, which is that, your mental model is that there is amazing work in your head, and there's this pipe, right, where your work comes out, and the pipe is just stuck with crap, and you need to get the crap out, and eventually, the good stuff will come out. And I thought about it a lot when I was tweeting, because I'm like, I'm tweeting crap, but eventually the good stuff will come out. And better stuff came out eventually. But even now, I actually delete about 90% of my tweets. And the reason for this is because I learned how to tweet from a person named Julian Shapiro, who runs Demand Curve, and he gave me like this masterclass on tweeting. And the highlights of what he taught me was really interesting, which is that most people think the way you get followers is you have to have a very viral, interesting tweet. I had a tweet with like 20 million views. It got me like 20 follows or something. That is not how you get more follows. The reason why is because people don't actually follow anyone from a tweet. Like the button is not even visible. People follow people because there is a tweet or a tag or something, and it was so interesting about this person that you click into the timeline. And you follow people from their timeline. So what does that mean? It means that the content you have to tweet has to be interesting about you personally. And then when they go to your timeline is a landing page. And the landing page needs to be conversion optimized. So the things on your bio, your photo, your cover photo, and most importantly, your pin and top 5 tweets. And if those tweets are just like retweets, no one's gonna follow you. Why would you do that, right? And so the reason why I delete 9 out of my 10 tweets is that when I want people, when they land on my page, for every tweet to be a banger. And you landed, like, my conversion rate goes high. And you could A/B test this too. So one of the interesting things is in analytics.twitter.com, you can see the number of new followers you got in the previous month and a number of timeline impressions. And from that, you can estimate a conversion rate. And so from month to month, you can basically A/B test conversion rates improvements. So that's a highlight of like Twitter. And she should probably just tweet more about the work, and they'll get better at it.
I think we have time for one more question. If anyone, I see a hand in the back.
Thanks, Siqi. One question I have, I love the way that you talk about like this dominant worldview. I'd love to hear about how you convert that to Runway and like essentially like sell that.
I think I did that in the middle, but just to rephrase, the dominant worldview is that the office of the CFO is under a lot of pressure to be strategic, and there is a lot of products that help with this by saving the finance team time, by giving them more control, by making it faster to share reports. And with this time, they can now spend the time to be collaborative strategic. And the world is fine because these products are great. And our underdog worldview says that the subtle lie there is that saving time is not enough. That what actually needs to happen when you are being strategic is collaboration. And for collaboration to happen, people need context. And all the context in the world won't matter if people don't understand what they're looking at. And so at the core of our story is that saving time is table stakes not enough. What really matters is understanding, and no one is saying that thing. And our entire product and our marketing is oriented around that one message. How do we create clarity and understanding between finance and all the other people that finance work with?
Siqi, sure, we'll do one more.
Just one more question for me. How much do you think, like, if you don't like truly believe in the story that you're telling, like whether you need to change the story itself, or whether you need to change what you're working on? Or how much do you think it's the story versus what you're working on?
I think it's the latter. Yeah, I mean, belief is like something deep inside, like vision, intuition. I think intuition is like a super powerful force. It's so just a sidebar of intuition, right? Like, I think people underrate intuition, and I underrate it too because it just seems like it's intuition. Like it doesn't compare to data and reason, all these things. But one of the things that was interesting as we were refreshing the Runway strategy last quarter is what I realized made it so difficult is that I was intentionally trying to not say the things that are obvious to me, the things that are intuitive to me, because they seem like trite or whatever. But we all have different superpowers. And when we have those superpowers, the things that are associated with superpowers are the things that tend to be obvious to us, but not to other people, intuitive to us and not to other people. And so often, I mean, not all the time, but often intuition is something that reflects those superpowers, our unique experiences that we learn through the world that is so true and so obvious to us, and we're so quick to see it, no one else can, and those are the most important things. And so I would say, yeah, it is pretty important, and if you don't really believe in it, then it's just that your intuition says there's something wrong or off about what you're doing.
That was a great last question. Siqi, is there anything you'd like, to tell everyone?
Bye, Runway.
Bye, Runway. All right. Thank you, Founders Inc., for hosting, and thank you so much, Siqi, for chatting with us.
Hello.